Hello, welcome to the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show podcast. I'm your host, Chris A. Matthews, and once again, I have a phenomenal guest. I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Elizabeth Polinsky, who is a therapist that specializes in working with couples. She's trained in EFT. We'll get into that a little bit later. She has a PhD in marriage and family therapist and a background in social work. How you doing, doctor?
I'm doing really good. Yeah, I'm doing really good. Thanks.
Well,
I'm excited to hear.
yeah, we're so glad to have you. And we'll jump right into it. Those that have followed our show in the past, they usually will be accustomed to my first question. I always love to learn from our guests what led you to wanting to work with couples.
Yes. Yeah, this is it's such a good question because I think everybody has such a unique journey. Um, so I always struggled in relationships myself. So before we started recording, you and I were talking about how there are statistics that are not even related necessarily to the specific relationship, but that impact kind of success rates in terms of divorce and whether people stay together. So, for example, coming from a divorced family, I came from a divorced family. My parents were a dual military couple, and military life played a pretty big role in their relationship decline. And as I was going through, my teen years and my young adult years and all of those times, I just really struggled a lot in relationships. And so I was in counseling myself. And my therapist was the one who first said, Liz, I think you should consider pursuing counseling. And so I did. And when I was in my master's program, I came across emotionally focused therapy, which is EFT for short. Fell in love with the model during my master's program. But when I got out, I worked for the government, mostly for the Veterans Affairs Hospital, although I did work briefly for a state department of mental health in South Carolina, actually, and because I went to USC for my master's. And when I was in the government and working at the VA, the focus is just so heavily on individual counseling that there wasn't the opportunity for me to really pursue couples therapy the way that I wanted. And so when I met my husband, the person who's now my husband, I was working at the VA, predominantly doing trauma-based counseling, loved that job. I got to do like research and clinical training for social workers there at that hospital. And it was just a really awesome job. I did not want to leave. But my husband is in the military. And so when it came time to be like, okay, I guess I'm going to commit and start moving around, I decided to go back and really learn couples therapy because it was a dream I had always wanted to learn, partially because of the struggles that I experienced, but also that my parents experienced. I can look at that generationally going back. My mom's parents were never together. My dad's parents, there were multiple divorces for his mom and remarriages. So I can anyway, I just knew that I was not set up for success.
It all comes together. I always use the phrase wounded warriors, right? Or wounded healers, excuse me. When you think of therapists, we've had our own wounds, and through healing our wounds by way of counseling, usually we tend to seek a desire to help others. And you have so much practical experience outside of just book knowledge. Living with a partner who's currently in the military and being a military spouse gives you a whole nother perspective, because it's not just something you're reading in a book. When those couples come into your office, you know what it's like to be in their shoes. And you also talked about characteristics that align with our Marriage Underdog brand, with statistics that may not correlate directly to your relationship, but indirectly impact that, and our family of origin. So having parents that divorced or may not have been able to develop healthy relationships. And one of the luxuries of our work, we get reminded on how to do it the right way every day. Right now, if we decide to use it or not is one thing, but we are reminded of it. I want you to also share a little bit more about the approaches you take with military couples. So start, for example, like from the assessment phase, like if a military person is listening now, or a spouse is listening now, and they want to reach out to you, and they're nervous and they're concerned, right? Like what about like the confidentiality? Some people might think, well, if I'm in therapy and I'm in military, is it going to impact my spouse's, job? Can you share some light on that process for those that might be listening that want therapy and they're in the military, but they're afraid of utilizing the services because of how it might impact their job?
Yes. Yeah. So typically the concern of, will this impact my job, is around, will the service member receive a mental health diagnosis as part of the work?
Absolutely.
So there are several services that are provided by the military, such as Military One Source. In the Navy, it's called Fleet and Family Services, is another resource. But there should be some sort of family advocacy program on every base, whether it's Marine or Army or Air Force as well. And they provide free non-medical counseling to service members and service member families. And so that is one avenue that they could get free marriage counseling, and they would not receive a mental health diagnosis. If they go out in town somewhere, someplace that's not military based, to use their TRICARE insurance, there does have to be a mental health diagnosis. The way that people tend to get around that is to have the civilian spouse be the primary patient on record. And so that way the spouse has something like depression or anxiety, whatever, an adjustment disorder, because the husband just got back from deployment, whatever it is. And that is another way that it protects the service member. Of course, then you can pay just out of pocket and not use insurance and see somebody in the community. And that doesn't, a mental health diagnosis is not a requirement for counseling. It's only a requirement.
Yeah, it's only required for insurance. I'm so glad you're bringing this topic up, because even for those that are listening that may not be in the military and you're calling around trying to find a counselor, that's not explained to most people. Most people don't realize that when you use insurance, by law, by definition, it's for mental health emergencies. And a lot of couples that are coming in, there's an emergency need, there's an urgent need, there's an emergency within the relationship that needs to be healed or fixed, but that may not always render or warrant, a mental health diagnosis. But to use insurance, one has to be given. I'm so glad you brought that point out. And your private practice, you take insurance as well, or do you do just all fee for service, right?
Yes, I'm private pay. So,
and that protects the clients.
Yes, it does. I have a lot of people who want to work with me because I'm not affiliated with the military, because they have those concerns, even though there are ways around it. There's also some quality. I think there's some quality concerns as well when it comes to things like Military One Source. My husband and I went through Military One Source for our premarital counseling, and we were matched with somebody who didn't even do couples counseling. She She sometimes worked with foster kids, but she was predominantly a professor. So we had a really negative experience with Military OneSource. So while there are free resources, there's also oftentimes a quality issue with something that comes for free. So a lot of people will come to me because of the more expert training, but also because I'm not affiliated with the military.
Absolutely. And you're bringing out a harsh reality in our country.
Mm-hmm.
Quality marriage counseling is a luxury.
Yes.
And I hate to say it that way, but it's really true, because my wife and I, we've actually gone down that path, to find marriage counselors. And when you seek out someone that is an expert in their craft, one is supply and demand. There are not enough quality trained marriage counselors for the need. Two, when you think about insurance companies, they put all these parameters on how to provide treatment. And there's something in particular, like, for example, when I do my therapy, the first session, I always do a minimum of 90 minutes. So I can do a quality assessment and I can track what the needs are, and I can develop a comprehensive treatment plan that fits the client, versus with the insurance, I have to make the client fit the billable note. And I can't have the freedom and flexibility to integrate different modalities, because not all treatment modalities are covered by insurance. And I want you to speak more on EFT. I know that was the model you mentioned that you fell in love with. Can you give our listeners, and I know it's really tough to do this, especially from being an expert in the model, but could you dumb it down and just give the listeners a basic overview of the value of EFT and why it's one of the golden standards in our craft of marriage and couples counseling?
Yes. Yeah. So, in emotionally focused couple therapy, there are 3 stages, and the research is pretty clear that people have the most benefit if they go through all 3. Although it is pretty common that couples will feel satisfied after the first stage and choose to end at that point. Stage 1 is maybe communicating for understanding. So oftentimes couples have maybe conflict arguments around a variety of topics, but the way that they argue, the way that their conflict plays out, has a very similar pattern to it every single time. And so they end up in these conversational spirals. I have one couple that I work with that calls it a death spiral. And I think that is a really good phrase, because it feels incredibly painful for both people when this communication spiral gets spiraling and feels very out of control. So the first stage is about looking at what is your specific kind of communication spiral. What's the pattern that all of your conflict seems to be having? And usually that comes from ways that we're both emotionally reacting to each other. And then when I emotionally react, then you start emotionally reacting, and we go back and forth.
Right.
So a lot of that is, can we slow it down so that way you both can have more emotional awareness of what is happening that makes you want to react? Can you start communicating that in a clear way, not to change anything, but just to create understanding between the two of you? So that way one
that brings me to the point. So one of the things I always tell couples is, listening doesn't have to lead to consent. And it feels like in that first stage, if you're on this death spiral or in this toxic cycle, the partners are now focused on feeling right versus feeling heard. It sounds like that phase could evoke a lot of defensiveness.
Yes, yeah, like if they are focused on being right, sometimes it's even both are focused on being heard, but neither one feels heard.
Oh,
And
okay.
they can get defensive. They could get defensive from that as well. But yes, yeah, they're not working towards getting understanding first. Or they're not conveying that they are understanding their partner before responding. So,
And that can be tough, especially when you're used to not listening and you're used to speaking to only be heard. And you said slowing down in that phase. I believe that was really important. And that's all in the first phase.
yes, yeah, the first phase is the longest, tends to be the longest for people. So, yeah, and that phase sort of ends when they have the ability to both pause a spiral like that and communicate clearly about what is going on emotionally for each other without the spiral then starting up again.
Gotcha. And that would make sense why that phase is usually the one people want to stop at. Because it's like, all right, we have this master skill. We're not in these volatile conflicts or the heated arguments. Everything's kind of simmered down. We're good to go. Now, the research shows that all three phases create better outcomes. So what's the next phase after you get to that point where you're able to slow down and understand each other?
Yeah, so in the second stage of the therapy, we're really looking at what were some of the underlying relationship fears that were causing the cycle to begin with. And this often stems back to past relationships, things in childhood with your parents. If I felt abandoned, rejected, that no one loved me, that I wasn't wantable, these sorts of really deep fears that can happen for people. Helping couples be able to talk about that level of fear that they have in their relationship, and if needed, to directly ask for reassurance or comfort or what it is that they need in that moment when their fears come up. And that is sort of the second stage of the work, that both people are able to do that. And then the third phase is using basically all the skills you've learned so far and through the therapy process to address any other things that haven't been addressed. Like if parenting concerns are starting to come up, how do we do this together? It wasn't quite the focus before, but now you can use the same skills to address anything like that.
Gotcha. Man, that's pretty intensive. And within the stages, I know there's steps.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can the steps in stages be done do they have to be done in an order? Does it have to be linear? Like step one, step two, phase one, phase two? Or do you find that in your work, even in phase one, you may go a little bit further, a little bit faster and pull out family of origin in phase one, even though you're not already, you haven't completed the ability for couples to hear each other all the way, but you're talking about the family piece? Or does it all have to be done in a specific order?
I think I would go with what the couple brought me. So I'm using a particular process to help us go through the stages, and whatever the content is, whatever the topic they want to talk about, I can do what I need to do to help us move forward regardless of the topic. So if a couple wanted to be talking about that, we could talk about it and I could keep us in the process. But I'm looking at that sort of thing when I'm doing my assessment, but I'm not generating topics for the couple because I'm trying to help facilitate changing that spiral, which is the way that they go about talking about the topics. So they can bring me any topic and we're going to talk about, okay, how can you start talking about this in a new way?
What you just shared, and this is my opinion, is the cornerstone of what makes a licensed marriage and family therapist or a trained EFT counselor different than your generic therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And just to highlight, in layman's terms, you said the process is always going to supersede the content. When couples come into counseling, they're focused on content. Who was right? What happened? There's always going to be new content as long as you're married or you're with your partner. The therapist teaches you how to take any content or any story or any problem or issue and walk it through a process where it can be dissected and understood. Because at the end of the day, the emotions that are evoked are gonna be the factors that make or break the relationship.
Yes. Yeah. I think that does make a difference. I think you and I probably share a similar pet peeve around people who are not trained in marriage and family therapy or EFT and who end up sort of dabbling in couples therapy.
Now talk about the dangers, because I don't want people just to be listening like, oh, you're just one of those researchers, you're hating on the field, or oh, you're no, I'm upset more so to see people get damaged by therapy, which is supposed to be a tool to be used to help. It's not a jab at people that want to help other people. I think there's an unintentional harm that's not talked about. Can you share the why?
Gosh, that's there's so much there. So let me see if I can organize my thoughts real fast. One, there are a couple of cornerstones, I think, to marriage and family therapy that are not that are missing when somebody doesn't have adequate training in their background and they've just kind of worked as an individual therapist. One is being able to stay neutral between the couple and to be able to validate both sides, be able to see the situation from both people's perspective, stay neutral, and then try to see how the puzzle pieces fit together. So often I'll have couples who say, we tried a marriage counselor in the past, but they took the other person's side. And that can feel really painful to invalidating. And it can also make it harder for someone to then go get help. It sort of damages the reputation of marriage counseling, because then if somebody had a bad experience with a marriage counselor who actually wasn't very well trained, other people may then be hesitant to actually seek help. Part of this is also education about what is needed when looking for a marriage counselor or a relationship therapist.
Back to the taking side piece. That tends to happen when someone's not trained because they get caught up in content and not process. The therapist has to be mindful that the counselor's job isn't to be so immersed in the content that they lose sight of the process. It's our job as therapists to create and maintain the balance for structure. We want to win that battle for structure while losing the battle for initiative. The initiative is that couple who wants to do the homework, wants to come on time, wants to be open to the strategies, the techniques, and the approaches. The therapist creates a container or a place where that can happen. And the content, once again, is always going to change. But what I see is that you have untrained professionals that have done something in their own relationship that worked, and then they believe that that one thing is going to work across every relationship. So they got one tool. And when that tool doesn't work, they then blame the client versus taking it in on themselves to realize they don't have enough training. Because one of the things about marriage and family therapists, we're very model driven in terms of our training and how we're taught. But I use the analogy like a golfer, right? Even if you don't play golf, you understand the concepts to get a ball in a hole, right? And there are different clubs you use. The clubs are used based on where the ball's at. The driver has a larger head to hit the ball farther. The putter is more narrow to hit the ball closer to the hole. So the same way a therapist, a LMFT, has a model or have models in our pocket to pull out, we're using the models based on where the ball or where the client lands, where they show us where they need us to be. And I believe that that's not taught by all therapists, or to all therapists, excuse me. They're not taught that. And instead, they go in and they're just trying to do one thing. If it doesn't work, they throw their hands up. I know you have this experience. How many times have you been in therapy and you have to change your approach in the midst of doing something? You have to do something else because it just didn't work. You don't take it personal. You're just like, oh, I got to try something else. But you have to be equipped with the skills to do that, though, right?
Yes, I really like that golf analogy because I think you're right. They come up with like a tool or go on date nights. Why didn't date nights fix everything for you?
Right.
Sort of like one like using the putter to then do your whatever that initial shot is.
Driver, yeah.
Yeah.
It didn't work. What's wrong? It's like, because there's so many different complex people and relationships. And then the other piece I think that I want you to speak on, treating the relationship as its own entity.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps prevent taking sides, because the side that the therapist is on is the relationship side. What do we do collectively to help the couples come together in that shared space, which is the relationship? And I want you to talk on that. Like, how do you work with couples to treat the relationship and not get caught up on the two individual people?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm having a memory because I am teaching a class, like an introduction to working with couples and families right now, and the students had to do role plays. And this was one of the challenges that I saw for a lot of the students, which is normal for where they're at in their learning development, right? But they would say things like, it was a role play with a mom and a child, but very similar. They would say things like, Mom, you need to understand where the kid is coming from, or a kid, you need to understand where mom is coming from, without first validating where the mom was coming from or where the kid was coming from. And that is part of what a marriage and family therapist does, and somebody who's actually trained in EFT, is I can validate the difficulty of this situation for you without invalidating what the other partner is going through or their perspective on how it is. And that is part of treating the relationship as an entity, because you're constantly moving. You're moving from, I'm looking at the relationship dynamic and how the puzzle pieces go together and the process that you both are in to help change that. But then I also have to be able to come close emotionally to both of you to understand your individual perspectives, validate how painful and uncomfortable that is for you, but then also be able to move the process back out and link that into, when you are in so much pain because you're feeling not heard, that's when you start shouting at your partner to try to be heard. That makes so much sense to me, that when you feel a lot of pain at not being heard, you try harder to get heard. But then to link that back to the process of then when you try to get heard, when you do that in a way that's yelling, your partner then has a reaction to that yelling, and they don't actually ever hear about the hurt feelings that you have.
Absolutely. One of the things you're bringing to mind now as you speak, the luxury of learning the different models and theories, they all overlap.
Mhm.
They overlap in a lot of unique ways, but yet they're very similar because what you just described was extracting the problem from the person, right? And that's a narrative approach. So, like, when you know one approach or another approach, you can combine them because the interventions may be the same across different approaches. So, approaches may share the same interventions, but they're different in nature based on the theorists that developed it or some different nuance, but they can be similar. And what you just described, I always share with couples like, hey, you're not the problem, she's not the problem, or he's not the problem. Let's make the problem,
Yeah.
right? And taking that identity away from the problem of the person having the identity of them being the problem, right? And when you do that, it creates a fair space where neither partner feels like a side's being taken, or they're feeling um, judged or accused of being the issue, because nobody wants to be the problem. Right? And that's the issue with even going back to our initial dialogue around insurance. Can't bill two people's insurance, so it's almost humorous. I had a supervisor, he said, yeah, when you bill insurance for couples counseling, you're basically asking which couple wants to be the problem. So who wants to be the billable problem? Right? Like, who wants the diagnosis? And that brought that topic to mind. I know our time is running out, and I want to ask you as we close, because this has been phenomenal. I really appreciate your insight, and our dialogue went in a different direction. For the most part, we wanted to focus on EFT, which we did, but I love just you sharing your thoughts around what couples who are listening now, like, they may need therapy, how to select a therapist. The military piece was huge, and the component of making sure that couples know a well-trained therapist does not pick sides, and the confidentiality component of why insurance may not be a good fit if you're looking for high quality therapy for couples work. Um, I want to close out. What projects, if any, are you working on? How can clients connect with you? Are you taking new clients? I know you're doing a lot of telehealth work. Just in closing, share with the listeners a little bit about how they can interact with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So I am taking new clients. I'm licensed in several states because we move around all the time with the military. I think I'm licensed in like 6 states, but South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Nevada, Arkansas. And my counseling practice is elizabethpolinskycounseling.com. You can find all the information there for both like your kind of typical weekly counseling and weekend long intensives. I also do therapist supervision in emotionally focused therapy, and that is on that website as well. And for military couples, in particular, I have a podcast called the Communicate and Connect podcast for military relationships. And that is like a resource for military couples, where we go over some general marriage counseling, like marriage information, but also applying it to military specific stressors like deployments and reintegration. And yes, yeah, that's my counseling practice. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I will definitely have
Yeah,
that.
that's the podcast. So you can get to the podcast from the counseling website as well. They're linked to each other. But I think that, we did not get to do as much, but there are extra barriers for military couples to get marriage counseling services. And so my hope with this podcast was to be able to provide some things for military couples in particular to be able to work on hopefully improving their relationship, even in the times when they couldn't access because their partner is deployed or because they have shift schedule work or whatever it is.
Definitely. I'm so glad that we had you on, and it's not uncommon to have guests on again as well. So I'd love to schedule an opportunity to have you back on and focus more on the military families and couples that you work with, especially just to highlight once again the fact that you are in the position as a military spouse. You walk every day in those shoes. So the level of empathy is different than someone that just works with couples in the military versus someone who works with couples in the military and is a military spouse themselves. So I just want to highlight and thank you for your service because it's a family ordeal. You as a spouse are serving right alongside your service partner, so it's a family ordeal. It's not just one person, and I want to highlight that and applaud you as well for your support for your husband and just keeping the family together while he's doing the things that he has to do, and then the travel that takes toll as well. As soon as you get rooted in one community with friends and social networks, or even professionally, you got to move again. So that's dedication and commitment. Uh,
Thank you.
Dr. Polinsky, I'm just thankful you were on. Those that have been listening, you've been tuning into the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show podcast. I'm your host, Chris A. Matthews. We launch a new episode every Tuesday on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, also YouTube. Once again, Dr. Polinsky, thank you. And for those that have tuned in, we appreciate it. Like, leave comments, and hopefully this was a episode that provided value.